One evening, I went to a big baseball game. After it finished, I chose to walk around the city to avoid the heavy traffic. I wandered for nearly an hour. When the streets became quieter, I thought it was time to return to my car. I had roamed further than intended, exploring some old familiar buildings that were quite far away. By the time I made it back to the parking garage where I had left my car, the place was almost empty. My car was parked several floors up. As I stepped into the stairwell, I noticed a man leaning against the wall. He was a tall man with long hair, holding a cigarette. His look was sharp and unwelcoming as I entered. I didn't understand why he was just standing there, but I hurried past him and started climbing the stairs. When I reached the second floor, I heard footsteps. The man was following me, though I couldn't see him. I kept going until I reached my floor. I left the stairwell and entered the parking area. Halfway to my car, the stairwell door slammed shut behind me, and I heard running footsteps. I spun around to find the man sprinting towards me. For a moment, I froze in fear. Then I bolted towards my car as fast as I could. I was only a few steps away from safety when I felt his hands clamp down on my shoulders. He threw me to the ground and climbed on top, throwing punches. I shielded myself and yelled, struggling against him. I managed to kick, throwing him off balance slightly. Our struggle lasted a few tense seconds before I successfully kicked him off by targeting his legs. I sprang to my feet, dived into my car, and slammed the door. His arm was caught briefly, but I pushed it out and locked the door. I didn't hesitate. I started the car and drove away immediately. He banged on my car as I sped off, but I was just relieved to escape mostly unharmed. I still don't know why he attacked me since he didn't try to steal anything. I've never returned to that parking garage again. It was a really long night. I had just finished delivering goods in Nebraska, but I was only halfway done. I needed to drive back to Minnesota and was hoping to reach home by morning. Then, suddenly, it started to snow. I was caught off guard because I had just listened to the weather forecast a while ago. Soon, the light snow turned into a heavy blizzard. I noticed other cars heading the other way starting to stop, so I figured it would be silly to keep driving. I pulled over in South Dakota, close to a place called Rockerville, right off the main road. My truck began to make strange sounds, so I parked it as close to the edge of the road as I could to avoid getting hit by passing cars. I've been a truck driver since I was 22, and now at 36, I knew to always be prepared. I quickly grabbed some extra blankets and a few other things from the back before jumping back into the driver's seat. I turned on my CB radio, hoping for any news about the storm, but all I heard was static. Worried, I checked the engine and found the fan belt broken in half. I thought the best thing to do was to call for a tow truck, so I looked up a number and waited in the freezing cab. Even with the blankets, I couldn't stay warm. The snow seemed to fall harder, and the wind felt even colder. I remember being stuck like this once before, but it didn't seem as bad as this time. Trying the radio again, I finally heard something other than static. It sounded like a distant voice, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. Annoyed and frustrated, I cursed quietly to myself. Then, in the unusually bright moonlight, I saw something moving in the trees nearby. It looked like there was someone out there, holding something near their face. This was really unexpected and a bit scary, seeing someone appear from the woods in such a remote place. I didn't know what to think, so I slightly opened the door and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no reply, which immediately felt wrong. I tried calling out again, but got the same silence. What was this person doing out here in the middle of such terrible weather? And why wouldn't they answer? I sat there, watching closely, trying to see through the swirls of snow, wondering what to do next. The situation was getting more tense by the minute. I shut the door and my heart raced faster. I was becoming very scared. The man began walking towards my truck. Now that he was closer, I could see he was an adult. He stopped at the edge of the trees, just a few steps away. I noticed he was holding a walkie-talkie. He brought it to his face, and I realized he was the source of the static noise I had been hearing. The wind was blowing into his microphone, creating that static sound. Then, something even scarier happened. The man started laughing through the radio. It wasn't a normal laugh, it was wild and crazy. I suddenly felt like I was in real danger, trapped with no way out. Panicking, I rushed to the back of the cab and tore open my toolbox. I grabbed a small wrench. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I hid behind the curtain in the back, ready to defend myself if he tried to break in. I grabbed my phone to call the police. But then, my phone died. My truck was dead too, so I couldn't charge it. I felt hopeless, waiting for the tow truck, which might not arrive for an hour. I left the CB radio on in the front and could hear the crazy laughter again. It felt like it lasted forever. Finally, the laughing stopped. A minute passed, then 2. I began to feel a bit safer, hoping the man had left. But then, I heard someone trying to open the truck door. I sweated despite the cold, full of adrenaline, ready to fight for my life. The noise stopped, and then there was a loud bang. It sounded like he was kicking the door. I was sure the lock wouldn't last if he kept at it. Just then, I heard another vehicle. I jumped up, pulled the curtain, and moved to the front of the cab, hoping it was the tow truck. And it was. The man saw it and ran back into the woods. Ignoring the harsh wind and snow hitting my face, I ran to the tow truck. I was so relieved. I thanked the driver as I climbed in. I was safe at last. Later, I learned that the man had been hitting my cab with a rock. He had damaged the door handle badly. The mechanic said he was almost through the lock. It was the most frightening night of my life, and I'm lucky the tow truck answered my call, or I might not be here to tell this story. So this whole mess began a few years back and only ended about 4 months ago. I think it's finally okay to share it, given how far things went with this guy trying to reach me. It all kicked off in late 2013. Back then, I used to go to these gatherings, sort of gloomy but still kind of fun, set up through Tumblr and similar sites. Teenagers ranging from 13 to about 19 would get together to hang out, smoke, and drink. Just really social stuff. Everyone would show up in cool outfits. Growing up in Britain meant that these meets were a mix of different cultures and styles like punk and decor girls. I used to find these meets and other events enough to keep my restless young self quite satisfied. During this period, I had also run away from home for a bit. I would crash either at my grandparents' flat or just roam around London all night. That experience led to a few other eerie stories I might share someday. Just so you know, I'm not someone you'd easily mess with. I'm 6'4", and back then I sported a mohawk. Once, at one of these meets, my buddy Moonshine passed me some homemade liquor and invited me to meet a friend of his. I'm usually up for chatting, so I joined them. But to my surprise, this guy was older, around 22 or 23, with a completely bald head and these dark smudges under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. We started talking, and he mentioned he worked with the BBC, chatting up a storm about media and potential career paths. Initially, I doubted him, but he seemed okay after we talked more. After a bit, we moved to the Macy's nearby. I pulled out my diary. I don't really know why I was keeping one then, maybe just a teenage whim. As soon as I took it out, he got really interested, asking, "What's that? Do you write? Can I see it?" I felt a bit weird about it, but I let him look anyway. While he flipped through, he commented on how we seemed to connect in communication, giving me a strange look as if he'd discovered something incredible. I quickly took my diary back and sat close to Moonshine for the rest of the time there. Before leaving, though, I made the silly mistake of agreeing to add him on Facebook. Ugh, I thought to myself, what's the worst that could happen? Moonshine had good things to say about him, so I didn't see any harm in it. That same night, I got some cigarettes from a stranger and just headed home, not giving the whole thing much thought for a couple of months. But then things turned strange. He started liking every single photo I posted on Facebook and sent me messages saying how rare it was to meet someone as beautiful as me. I was puzzled. I didn't think he was talking about my looks. Maybe he meant my personality. Either way, it felt too much. He started making casual conversation, dropping hints about his interests in kink. Given that he already made me uneasy, this didn't help. Out of nowhere, he messaged me one day, going into detail about his fetishes, including wanting to put me in a leather suit shaped like a coffin and degrade me. Red flags went up everywhere, but I tried to dismiss it initially. I told him clearly that I wasn't interested, which seemed to upset him a lot. I should mention, I often use Skype to talk to people online. Once, while on Skype, he mentioned he was back at his place after a big party, which seemed normal for someone his age, but then he started talking off camera to his mom, which didn't really fit with the glamorous media life he claimed to lead. After the bizarre leather suit message, I stopped Skyping him, but he continued to send me messages, dozens of them daily, filled with random questions about my life and where I lived. Then one day, he told me he had written something about me. Curious, I read it. It was a 3-page story describing me sitting in a cafe smoking a cigarette that very morning, filled with weird sexual details. It was clear he had been watching me at the cafe, which was unsettling. I decided then to cut him off completely from my social media. A few weeks later, Moonshine reached out to me saying that this guy had started a blog where he wrote sexual fantasies about me, involving different types of restraints and scenarios. Since then, I've blocked him everywhere possible, making sure he can't find or contact me. Moonshine's friend also confronted him, really giving him a piece of his mind about stalking and why his actions were so wrong. My cousins and I have always been super close. They are twins named Tom and Jerry. We spent our childhood in a small town in Virginia, but everything changed when their dad found a new job, and they had to move to Kentucky. It was tough for me because we lived on the same street and saw each other every single day. As we got older, keeping in touch became harder. They started working full-time jobs, and I was still in university, so we only got to meet during the holidays sometimes. A few months back, Tom and Jerry called me up. We talked for a long time, remembering our childhood in the green hills of Virginia. We eventually started talking about our skiing adventures, something we loved doing together when we were kids. They mentioned how much they missed those spontaneous ski trips on snowy days. So we decided to set a date for old times' sake. Since I didn't have a job yet, I agreed to travel to Kentucky. It felt like reliving the old days, just in a new place. The drive was about 5 hours, but I was excited. I left early on a Saturday morning and arrived there around 9:30. They had found an amazing spot for skiing just 10 minutes from their home. We drove down a quiet road, away from any houses or shops, until we reached a bridge that crossed a deep gorge. Right before the bridge, we parked the car, got out, and started putting on our skiing gear. Just being on skis again brought back so many wonderful memories from our childhood. Tom, Jerry, and I were all buzzing with excitement. It had snowed a good bit the night before, adding to the already thick layer of snow, creating perfect conditions for our adventure. We skied across a large expanse of land and stumbled upon an old train station next to a deserted railway track. Surprisingly, the door was unlocked. We went inside and sat on a wooden bench fixed against the wall near the main counter. We talked about the old days, and the conversation just flowed. Suddenly, Tom stepped outside to smoke. Jerry and I kept talking, but within moments, Tom burst back through the door, his face white with fear. All Tom could say was, "Guys, there's someone out there." I couldn't believe it. I thought he was just joking around until he stared out the window and said they were coming closer. Jerry and I rushed to see, and true enough, there was a figure moving straight towards the station from the path we had taken, not too far away. My first worry was that it might be a police officer who had seen us and was coming to give us a fine for entering this place. But that didn't seem right since we were in such a remote area. As the figure got closer, it was clear it wasn't a police officer. It was a man wearing a red jacket and black shorts, which was odd because it was freezing outside. We stepped out, thinking maybe he was a local annoyed at us for entering the building. But when he saw us, he just stopped. He didn't move at all. Jerry called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned around and started walking back the way he came. It was weird, but we didn't dwell on it much. We went back inside to finish our snacks and then thought it best to head back to the car, especially since the man had walked towards where we parked. By the time we packed up and left, the man was nowhere to be seen. We followed our earlier ski tracks in the snow, moving slower now because the ground was rising. When we reached the spot where we had first seen the man, we noticed his footprints. We couldn't tell where he was now, but his tracks followed the path we had made. I felt uneasy, wondering if he had been watching us all day. Something was not right. Why would he follow us? And why walk exactly where we had been? Another hour passed, and we still hadn't seen the man again. But his footsteps were clearly in the same direction as ours. Now, I was really worried, and I could tell Tom and Jerry were too. He had to be nearby. Soon we could see the bridge ahead, and we hurried, wanting to get to the car and leave this place. As we neared the bridge, I looked up and saw something there that made me stop dead in my tracks. The man was on the bridge, waving at us. We stared at each other, shocked. This person had followed our trail all the way to the old train station and was now waiting as we returned. It was unsettling, but we were 3 grown men. We thought we could handle any trouble if needed, so we didn't worry too much. We began climbing the land next to the bridge, about 50 feet away. We lost sight of the man as we entered the woods beside the bridge. The hardest part was the climb at the end, because the slope was very steep. When we reached the top, I was the first to step out and look towards the bridge. He was nowhere to be seen, or so I thought. As we walked along the road, I noticed footprints coming from the woods ahead. The sun was setting, but there was just enough light to see the prints in the snow. They went straight to our car. When we reached the car, I saw the footprints had circled it several times, but thankfully the car was untouched. Then I saw the footprints on the side of the bridge where we had seen him standing. Curious and a bit worried, I followed them. They were unsettling to trace. They went to one side of the bridge, then to the other. But after the man walked to the other side, the footsteps just stopped. Tom, Jerry, and I were stunned as I showed them, and a chill ran through us. We figured it could only mean one of 2 things. Either the man had vanished into thin air on that side, or he had jumped off the bridge. I peered down into the ravine, but it was too dark and far to see clearly. This shook us up as we tried to make sense of what might have happened on our drive back. Maybe this was all a big misunderstanding, and the footprints led somewhere else we didn't see. But unless all 3 of us were mistaken, I'm sure they didn't. Deep down, I believe the person jumped. It's a terrible thought, but it leaves me with so many questions. Why did he follow us all that time? Did he need our help? Or was he planning something awful? Tom, Jerry, and I may never understand his reasons that day. Some years back, I packed my bike with camping stuff and spent nearly 7 months cycling over 5,300 miles across the U.S. I often chose to camp in the wild, finding quiet spots in the woods where people wouldn't likely find or bother me. I did this entire journey alone. It was mid-November somewhere in southern Washington state. My day was ordinary, just cycling, but by afternoon I started feeling a stomachache. It wasn't severe enough to stop me, but it was definitely there. I still decided to camp in the wild that evening. As the sun was setting, I easily found a spot to pitch my tent. After setting up, I followed my usual nighttime routine, writing in my journal and brushing my teeth before bed around 9:30 p.m. Riding a bike loaded with 80 pounds, about 36 kilograms of gear is tough. I used to eat around 4,000 calories a day and still lost weight, so it was worrying that I wasn't feeling like snacking that evening. After turning off my light and lying down, my stomach worsened. I felt so sick I sat up, ready to unzip my tent to throw up outside. But after a bit, the nausea faded and I lay back down. Then I felt sick again. Finally, at about 11:30 p.m., I vomited. I rinsed my mouth with some water from my bottles, drank a little more, and managed to fall asleep feeling a bit better. But only 2 hours later, the nausea woke me up again. I went through the same miserable routine. Around 2:30 a.m., I threw up a third time, rinsed, drank, and went back to sleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up again. Thankfully, I didn't vomit this time, but I felt sure I wouldn't sleep anymore before dawn. As I waited for sunrise, feeling awful, I made plans. I couldn't keep camping. I needed to reach a town. I had used all my water during the night. Luckily, there was a town about 30 miles away. Under normal circumstances, that's an easy ride for me. There was also a reasonably priced motel where I could rest and check my condition after a better night's sleep. Just as it was getting light enough to leave, I heard the soft sound of rain on my tent. I checked the weather on my phone, expecting the rain to stop soon. Indeed, the sound disappeared after about 20 minutes. It was time to act. I packed my bags, dismantled the tent, and loaded everything onto my bike. As I pushed it back to the road and mounted it, something immediately felt off. Dismounting, I spotted a flat tire. Just my luck. However, I was equipped with the tools, spare parts, and the know-how to fix it. My head wasn't clear, making the repair take much longer than usual. By the time I got moving, the rain had started again. With no other choice, I put on my rain jacket, turned on my lights, and continued. It wasn't even 8 a.m., and this day was shaping up to be the worst of my journey. Pedaling was torture. I was cold, drenched, and utterly exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally. I was hungry but cautious about eating too much due to my unsettled stomach, and I was thirsty from running out of water the night before. I couldn't remember feeling so hopeless during any part of my trip. Eventually, I reached the town. After grabbing some gentle food from a grocery store, I headed to the motel. It was still early, hours before check-in, but the receptionist must have seen how bad I looked and let me into a room ahead of time. After a long shower and a call to my mom, I crashed and slept for 13 hours straight. The next morning, I felt much better, refreshed, and ready to tackle the 60 miles to a larger city I had been eager to visit. Despite my recent ordeal, I managed to complete the distance by early evening. Unfortunately, the next day, food poisoning struck again while I was visiting a museum. I ended up spending the following day resting in a hostel, feeling quite ill. The lesson here is clear. Always let someone know where you are and when you expect to reach your destinations. Traveling alone, it's critical that someone knows your whereabouts. Imagine if the food poisoning had worsened, if I had needed hospitalization or medical help. It's chilling to think I could have died alone in the wilderness. This thought serves as a stark reminder of how fortunate I was to have escaped a potentially fatal situation. Even though it might not sound like it, this happened a long time ago. I was in the final years of high school and found myself alone at home one evening. My parents had gone to a wedding far enough away that they needed to stay overnight at a hotel, and my brother was working his night job. We lived in a well-known city on the East Coast, in a working-class area that was beginning to deteriorate. As a teenager, I liked spending time by myself. I wasn't a nerd or anything like that. I was a big guy, had a few friends, and went on dates. But being naturally introverted, I really enjoyed the occasional quiet evening at home alone. That weekend, I was especially looking forward to my usual routine whenever the house was empty. My plan was to play some games on the PlayStation, hooked up to the big screen TV, order pizza for a late dinner, and just relax watching some shows. My dog, Max, a beagle who had been with our family for about 8 years, was old and usually very calm. He spent his days quietly asking for food and sleeping. Max, unlike most beagles, never howled or barked much. He was usually happy just to lay his head on your lap and stay there all night. It was around 1 a.m., right after I finished the last slice of pizza and was starting to fall asleep on the couch, when I heard a loud crash from the back alleyway. The noise didn't really shock me, since it's pretty common to hear unexpected sounds at night in the city. But Max's reaction was unusual. He suddenly lifted his head from my lap, and the fur along his spine bristled. He was always a bit nervous, so I stroked him to calm him down and started drifting off to sleep again. Just a few moments later, another loud crash echoed through the house, and Max did something I had never seen him do before. He jumped off the couch and sprinted towards the door that led to the basement, barking and growling like he was much larger than he actually was. His expression was fierce, reminding me of a police dog in action. Seeing him like this was startling and got my heart racing. Amid Max's barks, I could hear a continuous pounding noise. There was a rarely used door in our basement that opened into the back alley. It was old and rusted, difficult to open even with a key, and it creaked loudly. I quickly realized someone was trying to break into our house through that basement door. This is a lesson I learned quickly from living in a troubled area. If someone tries to break into your house and gives up when they find the door locked, they're after your belongings. But if they keep trying despite the locked door, they're after you. With this chilling thought, I dashed upstairs to grab the heavy wooden baseball bat I kept under my bed for such emergencies. Then I headed back down to the basement. I probably should have run away, but as a teenage boy who thought he was tough, running didn't seem like an option. Plus, I really had nowhere else to go. As I made my way to the basement stairs, Max charged ahead of me, showing the vigor and fierceness of a much younger dog. Suddenly, a man's scream of fear pierced the air, and the pounding on the door ceased. Since he never actually broke in, I didn't think to call the police or anyone else, which in hindsight was probably the most foolish decision I've ever made. Instead, I stayed up all night, baseball bat in hand, waiting and watching. When my brother returned home that morning, I explained everything to him. We decided to check the basement door, and as we pulled on it, the entire door came off its hinges. The intruder had been just one strong push away from getting inside, but Max's fierce barking had scared him off. I truly believe that Max, despite usually being a slow and quiet dog, saved my life that night. When I share this story, people often brush it off as just a dog acting naturally protective. But I know better. Max had never barked or moved with such urgency before. It was as if he knew how close the danger was, like he sensed the door was about to break. Years later, when Max was very old and tired, we had to put him down. I had a few moments alone with him before the final injection. I thanked him deeply for his loyalty and for protecting me that night. By then, I was an adult with a wife and children, and I often think none of that would have been possible without Max's bravery. So here's to you, Max. I miss you, buddy. So, let me begin by sharing that my mom raises me and my brother alone, because she often has to work late and can't leave her job early to pick us up from school. Because of this, we used a daycare service that would pick us up from school and take care of us, making sure we had snacks and fun, until Mom could come get us. Now, my granddad worked at a big company not far from the daycare, and my mom would sometimes take us to see him when she picked us up. One evening, when I was about 8 or 9, my mom came to pick us up as usual. We were waiting in the car when my brother suddenly said he needed to use the bathroom. We were parked outside Granddad's workplace, so Mom decided to take my brother back inside to use the restroom. I was left alone in the car, and I started feeling sleepy after the long day. Suddenly, 3 men dressed in bright work clothes and carrying shovels approached me. They told me they needed to take me to see my granddad. I had never seen these men before, even though they worked at the same place as my granddad. They insisted on taking me to him. At first I said no because I was really tired and just wanted to rest, but the idea of seeing my granddad got me excited, so I agreed to go with them. That's when they opened my car door, unbuckled my seatbelt, lifted me out of the seat and started leading me away by holding my hands. I didn't understand at that moment that I was being kidnapped. My mom and brother came out of the building at just the right moment after taking my brother to the restroom. My mom saw the men in their bright work clothes, holding shovels and trying to take me away. She started yelling, asking what they were doing, and rushed over to grab me from them. She looked really scared and didn't know who these men were. The company where my granddad worked was huge, with more than 1,000 workers, so it was impossible for her to know everyone. The men didn't try to escape. Instead, they quickly made up a story. They told my mom that I was crying because she had left and they were just trying to help her find her. They even said they thought I had been left alone in the car, maybe even forgotten. Looking back, I was only 8 or 9 years old and didn't really understand that they were actually trying to kidnap me. They tricked both me and my mom, almost getting away with a serious crime. After hearing their story, my mom decided to let it go. She explained she had only taken my brother to the restroom, and we were about to head back to the car in just a few minutes. No harm seemed to be done, and the men walked away, clearly relieved to have avoided trouble. But if my mom hadn't come out at that exact moment, I often have nightmares about what those men might have done to me and what their plans were. This strange and frightening event took place around 5 years ago. At that time, I was tasked with looking after my younger brothers while our father was away for the evening. I was 15 years old then, the eldest sibling, so naturally the responsibility fell to me. Among my brothers, the one who needed the most attention was the youngest, who was just 7 years old. My other two brothers were 11 and 13 years old. They usually spent their time together playing in their rooms, so they didn't need much supervision. However, my youngest brother, let's call him Kevin, needed constant watching. He spent most of that night sitting on my lap, watching me play video games with my friends online. Earlier that evening, our dad had ordered pizza for us, which got us all really excited. When the pizza delivery arrived, I managed to gather up only $3.50 for a tip. It wasn't much, but it was all I had, and I figured something was better than nothing. After I received the pizza, I called all my brothers to come and get their slices. We each took our pizza and went back to our respective rooms. As I resumed my game, one of my friends online made a joke about making sure I locked the door. Knowing I often forgot to lock it, he was probably just looking out for me. Prompted by his reminder, I quickly checked the front door, and sure enough, I had forgotten to lock it. I was glad for the reminder. I returned to my video games, but about 20 minutes later, my brothers, let's call them Alex and Michael, came rushing to me, panicked, saying there was someone in our backyard. Given that our house was quite isolated in the countryside of Kentucky, this was not only unusual but also deeply unsettling. It was also around 9 p.m., and our father wouldn't be back for several more hours. They explained that a stranger had knocked on the window, attempting to lure Alex outside. Michael had heard Alex talking to the man and quickly intervened, scaring the stranger away. Shockingly, the man had even convinced Alex to start unlocking the window for him. If Michael hadn't arrived when he did, I dread to think what might have happened next. I immediately called our dad, but he was too far to reach us quickly. As he hurried back, he phoned a neighbor who lived close by, asking him to check on us while he alerted the police. The neighbor's name was Mark. Mark was practically family to us, so I trusted him completely and let him in as soon as he arrived. We quickly explained the situation to him. Without wasting any time, Mark went out to search for the stranger. He found the man soon after, hiding in the darkness, nestled under the large pine tree in our backyard. Mark confronted him fiercely, managing to drive him away. He warned the intruder sternly that if he dared to return, he wouldn't leave on his feet, unless it was on a stretcher heading to the hospital. The man was so scared that he actually wet himself. He stammered to Mark that he was there for a drug deal and that things weren't as they appeared. And here's the shocking part. The police never showed up. That might be why Dad called Mark first. In our town, it was well known that you couldn't always rely on the police to arrive in time, if at all. Mark stayed with us until our dad got home, ensuring we were safe. After that night, our dad never left us alone at home again. Eventually, we moved to a different house about 8 months later. That entire night was nothing short of a horrifying ordeal. Many years back, my parents transformed our old garage into a big room where we could play and hang out. It was our favorite spot for video games, and where my parents hosted their friends. I was around 10 years old when, for maybe the second or third time, I found myself alone at home. My brothers and sisters had gone out, each busy with their own plans. That night I stayed up late playing games on our PS2, completely lost in the excitement. It was well into the night when I suddenly heard a tapping noise at the window. To make the room feel more like part of the house, my parents had built a proper wall where the garage door used to be. adding a window and a regular door with locks, just like you'd see on any house. Initially, I didn't even think the sound was real. My mind was too wrapped up in the game. The tapping sounded like fingers drumming in a quick rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, then again 1, 2, 3, 4, repeatedly without a break. This eerie tapping went on for about 5 minutes. It finally hit me that the noise wasn't from my game when I heard a knock combined with the doorknob rattling. Panic surged through me, and I tiptoed over to the door to make sure it was locked. To my horror, both locks were undone. Although the door often stuck as if it were locked, I quickly snapped both locks into place, making sure to do it loudly. I wanted whoever was outside to know they had no chance of getting in. The thought of someone lurking right there just beyond the door sent chills down my spine. Then I heard a deep, tired sigh from an old man, followed by a laugh that sounded truly scary. After that, the knocks on the door turned into loud bangs. It felt like he was hitting the door with all his might. I was just standing there, frozen by fear, when suddenly it all stopped. He walked over to one of the nearby windows and tried to peer inside, but a blanket was covering it. Even so, I could make out his shadow through the fabric, and my heart was pounding with terror. I stood there, not able to move, completely scared. Then he returned to the door and spoke in a creepy, coaxing voice. "Let me in, love. I'm cold and hungry. Don't you want to be nice to your neighbor?" At that moment, I turned off the light, dashed to my room, and hid in the pitch-black safety of my closet under a blanket. I stayed there until my parents came back from their anniversary celebration a few hours later. I never told them what had happened. I was young and more worried about being scolded for staying up too late than anything else.